Was ist das, die Philosophie? And will undoubtedly sound a little exaggerated, given that I'm talking about language, not about metaphysics. After this great lecture, we are now again to earth, because I'm really talking about the details this time, so historical details. But since we are discussing projects for a liberal education, Latin may have a role to play different from any other language. The teaching of Latin was for centuries the core of the Western higher education system, and the role of Latin was considered obvious and unquestionable in the standard curriculum of European and American high schools and universities. The crisis of Latin, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, parallels the crisis of the higher education system as a whole. This may be hardly a coincidence. The problem of a core curriculum, as raised by John Erskine 1 century ago at Columbia, had exactly this starting point. You know that John Erskine was not a professor of classics, he was a professor of English, but he realized that after the crisis of classics, and particularly of Latin, there was a desperate need of something able to unify culture. John Erskine tried first to propose his project in 1914, exactly 1 century ago, and after the First World War, he tried again, and this time he was successful. Of course, against my colleagues, so the professors of classics, who claim that reading Greek or reading Latin in translation, which is most typical of the great books project, as you know, was as reading no Homer or no Virgil at all. And there is a joke about this, because Erskine asked, oh, see, I do see your point, so no one in the audience here reads the Bible. Because only the professor of Hebrew was reading, of course, to read the original text. And my colleagues of Greek and Latin were a bit confused. The problem of, yes, the problem raised by John Erskine, how can we substitute Latin? Latin had been abandoned by many curricula of American universities, following the example of Charles Eliot, the well-known president of Harvard, and John Erskine planned his Great Books program because he was convinced of the need of a new unification of the higher education syllabus. This task had been fulfilled by Latin, but why and how? Charles Eliot is very important in this development towards research universities, of course, because he was following the German model. He traveled in Europe, and particularly in Germany, and he was impressed by the ability of German universities to develop research along with teaching. And so he changed the model at Harvard exactly for this reason. A parallel example from another culture and a completely different philosophical background. In his essays on school and education, the Italian communist writer Antonio Gramsci raised the same question. He took for granted that Latin, twinned with Greek in this case, I will comment about this later, was to be substituted by something else as a seminal subject in higher education. But he admitted, writing around 1935, so 20 years after John Erskine, that he was not able to suggest any real substitution, leaving the problem to future generations. Again, why and how was Latin performing this unification within the Western curricula? In other words, both Erskine and Gramsci took this for granted, that Latin was acting as a unifying subject in education. But why? yes, maybe Hegel is right. We can understand only when a certain stage is finished. Yes. Obviously, any attempt to formulate a decent answer to this question must trace the problem historically. Technicalities never give a real answer to cultural problems, and it does not matter if you are talking about ethics or about education. The role of Latin as the core of higher education was firmly established exactly when Latin became the international language. I'm talking about international language. It's very important to notice that in classical antiquity, the real international language was by far more Greek than Latin. The language used for commercial exchanges by the diplomats and so on was by far Greek, more commonly than Latin. When Latin became the international language, when Alcuin, invited by Charlemagne, exported to the continent the English system of a conscious bilingualism. To summarize the historical situation of the 8th century AD, in the continent, the transformation from Latin to the Romance languages was a process that was not proceeding at the same pace in the different areas. However, the standard situation of the continent was the lack of correspondence between sounds and letters, between spoken and written language. With an oversimplification, we could say that people were writing Latin and reading the early stages of Romance languages. This explains why Winfried Bonifatius, when required by Gregory II in 717 to give him an evidence of his knowledge of Christian theology, asked the Pope, because the Pope was a Roman, and this man coming from England who wished to be authorized by the Pope to go to Germany to baptize these people. The Pope was a bit the question was unusual, and the Pope was not sure, so he wished him to ask, how much theology do you really know? And Winfried asked the Pope to answer his questions, writing a short essay and not with an interview. The Pope, who was a Roman, spoke what Boniface called familiaritatis vestre sermo, so the language that you use in everyday speech, probably an early form of Italian. And the English monk was not sure to understand the Pope properly. Of course, the Pope was persuaded to speak Latin, but he was not speaking Latin anymore. The written form gave him no problems because he was confident to be presented with a text written more or less in the same standard form of Latin he was used to. In England, Latin had the function of a second language, and it was pronounced according to a simple one letter, one sound system, more or less as Anglo-Saxon. In other words, an Italian monk did not perceive that the language he was using in the liturgy or reading books was different from the language he was using in everyday conversation, but he perceived two layers of the same language, two varieties of one language. It's in Italy now dialects are more or less disappearing, but when in the areas of the country where dialects are still used, as in Britain, think of the areas of the north of the country, people perceive dialect as a variety of the same language, not as a different language. On the contrary, an English monk was obviously aware that the language of the liturgy and of the books and the language of everyday conversation were different. Think, for example, of the clear explanation given by Bede in his account of Caedmon's poetry. The English system, so he speaks of translation. the English system was imported into the continent by Alcuin, Latin became, to cite the words of Roger Wright, the professor of Spanish at Liverpool, who is the best scholar in this field, a second language for all, and the first language of no one. The implications of all of this with the new Roman Frankish liturgy and liturgical music, what they call the new imperial liturgy, is a very interesting field of research. In other words, Gregorian chant and so on can be explained only within this framework of the new international language. The practical consequence was that people were obliged to learn Latin, the international language, and the language needed to reach any level of education. Latin grammar and syntax were not cultural divertissements, they were the basic tools to gain access to the world of culture and of international communication. Learning Latin was a cultural but also a practical concern. This situation lasted for centuries. Learning Latin was learning a real language, necessary both for reading most of the cultural output of antiquity and of the Middle Ages, and for communication at various levels. The situation became different with humanism, when humanism and Renaissance changed the outlook on Latin. Medieval Latin was regarded as an inferior variety of the language, and the effort of scholars was to reconquer the splendor of classical Latin. The effect of the cultural transformation from a linguistic point of view is well sketched by a great specialist of Christian and medieval Latin, Christine Norman. Ce retour aux normes du latin classique assurera la survie de la tradition classique dans sa forme pure. L'héritage antique jouera un rôle important, voire décisif, dans le monde nouveau qui va se constituer. Mais désormais, le latin sera une langue morte, vénérable pièce de musée, gardée par ces conservateurs dévoués que sont les humanistes et les philologues classiques. Une langue morte, a dead language. There is just a mistake in this passage by Christine Norman. She says of the tradition classique dans sa forme pure, etc. But there is an important point that I will comment on later, that Latin never changed its morphological structure, and this is important. What changes is the construction of sentences, choice of words, terms of words, and so on, but morphology is still the same. Latin changed its status also because many practical tasks carried out using Latin as a tool of communication were slowly assigned to modern languages. It's a slow process. Consider, for example, the use of modern languages in the bureaucracy of modern countries. The shift from Latin to local languages made the ancient international language useless for potential speakers, such as members of the parliaments and the diplomats. Latin was slowly transformed in a language used in a few areas, basically useful to lawyers, priests, and obviously to teachers and professors of classics. Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher, earned his living as a lecturer of Latin style, of Latin composition. He was not paid as a philosopher, he was paid as a lecturer of Latin composition. Even in the 18th century, learning Latin had practical reasons. For example, it was essential both for clergymen and lawyers, and in the most important Italian novel of the 19th century, Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, Latin is referred to as the language of lawyers and priests, again. The first being labeled as bad Latin, the Latin of lawyers, because it's dangerous. Because lawyers will speak this language, you won't understand them, and of course they will do of your life whatever they want. And the second one, the Latin of the church, is the good Latin, il latino cattivo e il latino buono. Anyway, Latin remained in the standard curriculum. Again, why? At the beginning of the 19th century, Latin had to face the crisis of the Romantic Age, and it survived due to two and opposite reasons. The former has a German ground, and the latter a remote humanistic Italian origin. The great success of a new science, historical linguistics, rapidly altered the meaning of Latin. Latin was not anymore a normal language. It was twinned with Greek, a language that since the Renaissance had been part of the specialized syllabus of classicists, not of the general curriculum. And this is again very important. Take, for example, the Italian philosopher and writer and poet and whatever you want, Giacomo Leopardi. During Leopardi's life, in central and southern Italy, only about 15 or 20 people were really able to read Greek. So it's not a tremendous amount of people, it's a high school class. In the whole of the country, less than 100 people were able to discuss with Leopardi about Greek. Greek was not part of the syllabus. This is a tragic confusion because we also always think of Latin and Greek together. No, it's a modern invention. It's a modern invention of the early 19th century, and it's a German invention. And Latin became a relative of Sanskrit. Latin was normally studied with Greek. The invention of the Real Gymnasium in Germany, featuring Latin but no Greek, as in the proper gymnasium, took a couple of generations and was always regarded as a sort of deviation, a second-class school. In this way, Latin had been transformed into the ghost of a language, useful just to provide teachers with material for comparison in order to educate the teenagers to the mysteries of historical linguistics. Was all of this worth the effort? The other way to escape to maintain Latin in the curriculum was the survival of the venerable humanistic tradition, right Latin trying to mimic the style of the good old classics. Even Cardinal Newman, in his essays on university, already referred to before, writes a rather long article about the Latin style, providing his reader with a rich variety of examples of a good, meaning of course classical, choice of turn of words, of possible traps or common mistakes. But the meaning of the old humanistic obsession for classics had changed. In the original 15th century Italian version, all of this was a sort of dream. Revive the glory of an ancient culture, restore a better world, understood as opposite to the dark and bad Middle Ages. Middle Ages, something between the ancients and us. But in the 19th century, this novel, although plainly unreal, castle in the air, had long collapsed. And therefore, which was the reason to oblige kids to practice Latin composition or translation? The reason was the supposed logical quality of Latin. If you learn Latin, this was the mantra, you will improve your logical abilities and you will be able to control your deductive process. This was obviously plain nonsense, because if you want to improve logical abilities, a better suggestion may be to study logic. But the faith in Latin as an effective tool for testing students' abilities was very solid. A good example in England can be found in the books by Christopher Stray, you may have read, about the teaching of Latin and classics in the Victorian age and the first half of the 20th century. Stray is a very solid scholar, one of those people who spent a lot of time in archives trying to study school curricula, programs, comments of teachers, and so on. And the books are very, very good indeed, very solid. Believe it or not, if you, 140 years ago, if you applied to get a post in the British Empire, one of the most important exams was Latin composition. Yes, to become, for example, I don't know, the director of railways in India, Latin composition was required, because Latin composition was regarded as a good tool to control your logical and practical abilities. It's incredible, isn't it? For example, when the new unified Italian state, to take an example from this country, had to identify a reliable tool to select the leading class, a new country, of course, needs a new leading class, a new ruling class. Latin was the obvious choice. The new, terrible Italian top-level high school, called Liceo Classico, had a survival rate of 15%. And Latin was the essential instrument in organizing this very demanding leading class selection process. Therefore, learning Latin did have a practical reason. No Latin, no university, no admission to the high layers of the Italian society. But students, as remarked in the late 19th century, as well in the 20th century, were not really learning Latin. After 8 years of Latin, they were unable to read a passage from a standard Latin writer. And about Greek, scholars as Giorgio Pasquali and Giorgio Pasquali, who was professor of classics in this town, in Florence, and politicians as Giovanni Giolitti admitted that students' performance was even worse. In other words, Latin was used for something else, what we would call now problem solving. The new problem beginning in the late 19th century was, and still is, the fragmentation of schools and university subjects. I'm using the word fragmentation, referring to a short but very brilliant article by McIntyre, The Fragmentation in American Universities, where he comments about the American universities having too many subjects, too many disciplines. Any comparison of the present-day curriculum with the syllabus of 3 generations ago will show many new subjects. The fragmentation of disciplines challenged Latin for a simple reason. We are always short of time because we offer a lot of subjects and we cannot require students to spend 12 hours a day listening to lectures. So we must carefully select the subjects that are really meaningful. So what is meaningful in Harry Potter is not meaningful as a subject in a real school. And since the teaching of Latin has survived for targets such as problem solving, logical abilities, that could be achieved through other subjects, Latin was slowly cancelled from the curricula of most schools and universities. This being the situation, the reaction of classicists is generally the usual lamentation on the lack of cultural interest of politicians. Besides being obviously pointless, this attitude tends to obliterate the historical facts that I referred to. Shortly, the teaching of Latin was retained in the curriculum because it was believed to be useful for something else, and tools do change in human history. How can we make sense of Latin if we try to project a new form of liberal education? The first and most important assumption must be crystal clear. Latin is a language, and we want to learn Latin because we firmly believe that this language has a real importance in Western civilization. Which Latin? All of it. This is the central point of what I'm trying to say. Which Latin? All of it. not only classical Latin and so on. Bad Latin, good Latin, no. Latin does have varieties, but in all of these varieties, morphology, declensions, verbs, pronouns, remained identical. Varieties affect both the synchronic and the diachronic dimensions, as in any other language. Of course, British English is different from Australian English or from Texas English. But is it bad English or good English? It's simply English. But the stability of Latin morphology makes it possible to gain access through Latin to most of the voices of Western civilization from the classics to the 18th century. If through Latin we could have access only to the so-called classical age, Latin would be not worth the effort. I'm a professor of Latin, but frankly speaking, I like modern languages. And Latin literature as such is a good literature, but is not the best. Greek is definitely better. German offers a lot of incredible writers. English, you will use all your life to read what is worth reading in English. So Latin is not the first. So why should we study a language that has just a good literature, but not better than the German or the English ones? There is no reason. The reason is historical. If through Latin we could have access only to the classical age, Latin would be not worth the effort. And now my colleagues will shout at me as normal. They do. But Latin makes it possible to read Virgil and Seneca and Lucretius, but also Spinoza or Aquinas or Augustine or even Newton. The main problem that a liberal education has to face is undoubtedly provincialism, both in space and in time, as remarked by T.S. Eliot many years ago in what is a classic. I would add a citation from C.S. Lewis' preface to his last book, The Discarded Image. Lewis writes, "There are, I know, those who prefer not to go beyond the impression which an old world makes on a mind that brings to it a purely modern sensibility and modern conceptions, exactly as tourists who go abroad without even trying to make sense of what they see, firmly believing their way of life to be the best possible choice." The classical example is the Italian tourist who goes to Finland and tries to find a good pasta asciutta. And this happens, and these rascals do not know that a pasta asciutta in Finland will be a terrible experience, but they try to find it. Latin is not for these people. Liberal education is not a plan to develop a tendency towards idle curiosity. The obscure provincialism of the age of the web recalls the third interrogation of Eliot's The Rock. Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Of course, I'm just citing the third, not the second, about wisdom, because wisdom, I think, has completely disappeared. So we can ask something about knowledge and information. Wisdom for the next chapter. Latin is one of the keys to open the door towards our liberation from the cage, the prison of today's pseudo-knowledge. The door we never opened, the passage which we did not take. And the rose garden, dear friends and colleagues, is simply tradition, which means that each generation is not alone and shares the experience of those who were here before us and that are willing to transmit our own experience to those who will live after us. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Quia quos dedisti mihi non perditi. And this can be the meaning of this language, Latin. Thank you.